in the context of a rate cut expectation, investors are going to focus on that. The US is widely believed not to be going into recession, and that means that there'll be a higher tolerance for these geopolitical events. But I wouldn't dismiss them as noise. But they do really matter, again, as I said, for the reaction function of governments. I think they impact sentiment quite a bit, how safe people feel, how prosperous they feel. And they also provide a green light for revisionist powers, challenger actors, etc.
Markets like the US stock markets are powerful, but they're not omnipotent. They're really, really slow to identify true regime shifts. The problem becomes when everybody all of a sudden wakes up one morning and says, this is a lot worse than I thought it was, and the global implications start to matter to me. And that, by a textbook definition of somebody who spent 25 years in frontline markets, that's a textbook definition of a crowded trade.
European leaders, collectively and individually, basically said to their officials and their technocrats, no, thank you very much, not going to do that. The primary issue is Russia, Ukraine. The primary issue is the security of our own eastern border. We're very vulnerable there without American cover. That's the primordial issue. Everything else is secondary, and therefore we're prepared to put up with a very suboptimal, if I can put it like that, trade deal.
Now, secondly, why have earnings been resilient? Again, we have a couple of different themes, and AI is clearly a factor and supportive. But the other is maybe somewhat less obvious, which is inflation has actually been supportive as well, or maybe in some ways the nuances that differentiate between real and nominal factors in the economy.
The Supreme Court decision on the legality of Trump's tariffs is now expected in the first week of November. I've talked about how we should expect the pushback, such as it is, to the Trump 2.0 agenda to happen through the courts in America.
So CFIUS has been around for a long period of time. Now, the thing that's not particularly well known, but actually is part of their remit, is they can unilaterally open up an investigation into anything. They send their recommendations to the one decision maker in this space, which is the President of the United States.
The US only represents 13% of world trade imports. There's 87% of the import market, which isn't the US. The reason for optimism in the EU is finally some pennies are dropping. We have to go further, we have to go faster in some of our external relations. So last week, the idea of an EU free trade deal with Mercosur, which is the key Latin American players.
This is ultimately a pretty fundamental change in the rules of the game for private business in the US. All kinds of state interventions in private business, but examples include the recent pretty forced taking of a stake in Intel, the revenue share with NVIDIA or others, the ongoing discussion with TikTok, what would be the price to pay for being able to operate in the US. So there's a combination of issues surrounding regulation, revenues, taxation, market access,